Boardwalk Empire is one of the best series in the crime drama genre, and its main character, Enoch Nucky Thompson, is one of the best anti-heroes of his genre. He is a politician who has made his power in the New Jersey state almost absolute. He's a racketeer who has his share of every illegal enterprise in the Atlantic City area, and he's one of the biggest bootleggers of the Prohibition era. You have to agree, a very colorful character to succeed on both sides of the law at once. It's a pleasure to watch him on the screen. He certainly won't let you get bored. But what if I told you that Thompson, based on a real man named Johnson, who managed to combine all of the above in real life? And even though he had a lot less shooting, killing, and crime in his life, he actually managed to accomplish probably even more than his serial prototype. And if you want to know the real story of Atlantic City's most colorful boss, then please welcome Enoch Nucky Johnson on the other side of the law. Before we begin the story of our character today, we should first briefly recount the history of Atlantic City, where Nucky found his power. This is so that you can better understand how Johnson managed to be both a politician and a racketeer. The whole secret lies precisely in what Atlantic City was and how it came to be. Imagine modern-day Las Vegas. Bright signs, luxurious casinos, and comfortable hotels. Any food, any booze, any legal or illegal entertainment. Now transport all this experience to the early 20th century and you find yourself in Atlantic City. However, just some 50 years before that, Atlantic City was not like that. You might even say it didn't even exist at all. The place of the modern resort was just sands washed by the ocean. The man who managed to change that was an ordinary doctor, Jonathan Pitney, who had the idea of building a health resort there. The main problem for him in this venture, of course, was money. He could, of course, find the money to build the sanatorium, but not to lay a railroad line. And without it, his idea was doomed to failure, because getting to the future Atlantic City, located on Absecon Island, was extremely problematic, and the railroad was the only way to provide the resort with guests. At first, Pitney wanted to solve the problem with the help of the state by telling the authorities how good it would be for people if they could travel to the health resort by rail, but the authorities did not appreciate his idea and refused. Then, he changed his plan and went to New Jersey industrialists. Now, Pitney operated not with concern for the citizens, but with the fact that the railroad would allow the businessmen to cut logistics costs by many times over, as well as provide an increase in the prices of local land. So even if the investment in the resort does not pay off, they can always sell the land for more than they bought, and the railroad will serve their plans for decades to come. The first person who agreed to help Pitney was industrialist Samuel Richards. Together, they were able to raise enough money, and in July 1854, the Camden Atlantic Railroad was opened. And since Camden was not far from the big city of Philadelphia, hundreds of people immediately took advantage of the chance to visit the ocean in one day. But this was not what Pitney had in mind. He wanted to create a health resort for wealthy citizens. What he got was a beach village where workers would arrive in the morning and leave in the evening on their days off. Fare was still expensive for them, so they spent almost nothing at the resort itself. Besides, the trains themselves had no windows, and the trip was quite an adventure. Investors who brought Absecon land at $5 an acre before the railroad sold their land for $300 an acre after it was built, and were quite happy with the profits. They were not interested in further investment in the city, and new investors were extremely difficult to find. In 1857, the first economic crisis hit the States, and then the Civil War broke out. In such circumstances, Atlantic City was barely making ends meet. Things began to improve in the 1870s when Pitney died and Samuel Richards decided to take over the resort. He built another railroad line directly from Philadelphia and reduced prices to the point where even the poorest laborer could visit. And now not hundreds but thousands of working people came to Atlantic City for the weekend. The city, which had been conceived as a long-stay resort for the wealthy, became a day resort for working people. And while they still couldn't spend much money, there were a lot of working people coming. That is, the city began to make money, not on the quality of its visitors, but on their numbers. And where there are people, there are investors. And in the next 20 years, from 1880 to 1900, Atlantic City went from a beach village to the most visited resort in New Jersey. There were now bars, restaurants, and hotels, as well as brothels and gambling. It had everything the working-class commuters wanted. And the main task of the locals was to satisfy the demand of the guests at all costs. Atlantic City even had a saying to that effect. If people who came to town wanted to hear the Bible, we'd read it to them. But nobody ever asked for it. All anyone wanted was girls, drinks, and cards. The local authorities were of the same opinion. They realized that the resort they ran was based on the fact that people could get things here that were much harder to get in their cities. In Philadelphia, for example, you could not drink alcohol on Sundays. Atlantic City also had such a law, but the authorities turned a blind eye. And thousands of working people from Philadelphia could walk into any bar or saloon here and drink until they ran out of money. The same was true of prostitution and gambling. Even though these entertainments were outlawed, as long as they attracted tourists to the town and allowed the resort to develop, the authorities would look the other way. But the more guests came to town, the more brothel and casino owners made money. The harder it became for the authorities to look the other way for free. They weren't getting enough for the mere welfare of the city. They wanted their slice of that pie. And the authorities turned into racketeers who started demanding money for the opportunity to work. And after a while of such cooperation, it was already very difficult to know where the bosses of the criminal world and the bosses of the legitimate world were. The Johnson family appeared in Atlantic City politics just as the confluence of law and crime was just beginning. Nucky's father, Smith Johnson, was elected sheriff of Atlantic City in the late 1880s and remained in the position for several decades. Technically, he alternated between terms as sheriff and undersheriff since the position could not be elected for 2 consecutive terms. In fact, the executive power was in his hands. Smith was able to achieve this position through his acquaintance with Lewis Cunell, who in the future would be nicknamed Commodore. Cunell would put Johnson in touch with Lewis Scott, the county clerk, and Congressman John Gardner, who were by and large the masters of the city at the time. Cunell himself was very close to these two men and served as a kind of advisor and supporter to them, which would make him the future political leader of Atlantic City. Sometime in the mid-1890s, Cunell would begin to take the reins, and in 1900, when Lewis Scott died, he would take over everything, leaving Gardner behind. It is Cunell who is credited with making payments from illegal businesses to Atlantic City authorities regular and mandatory. He and Sheriff Smith Johnson, through raids and roundups, quickly got the idea across to all the businessmen. And now the city had 2 masters, Commodore Cunell and the father of our hero today, who could not even guess who his own son would become. Nucky himself was born in January 1883. At the time of his birth, Johnson already had a son, Alfred, who would follow in his father's footsteps and become a sheriff. Enoch would also be a sheriff for some time, but we'll talk about that a little later. Now, Johnson Jr. was still growing up, seeing before his eyes the example of his father, the second man in town, who was, in fact, the law. Nucky's childhood and youth passed just as most Atlantic City children do. He fished in the ocean, shot turkeys with his father's gun, and listened to numerous tales of adventure through local sailors. Enoch's education was complete, and he didn't drop out like most of the heroes of my channel. Those schools in Atlantic City at the time represented small houses from 4 to 5 rooms. Education was tolerable, and Johnson, after graduation, could even enter Trenton State Teachers College in the state capital. He studied there for only a year and decided that it was not for him, that it was better to start building a career. And where's the best place to do that? That's right, Atlantic City. Nucky came home and his father assigned him to the sheriff's office. At first, Johnson Jr. held a small position there, but by the time he was 21, his father promoted him to his deputy. Enoch's career was only going upward thanks to his patronage, which meant he could get married, especially since he had a sweetheart named Mabel with whom he dreamed of marrying since high school. And in 1906, those dreams became a reality. Nucky and Mabel became husband and wife. However, their marriage lasted only 7 years, cut short by Mabel's death from tuberculosis. They never had children, and the death of his beloved was a serious blow for Johnson. For many years, he did not get into serious relationships, and his friends said that after the death of Mabel, the only beloved Nucky was a politician. Whether this was true or not, Enoch did devote a great deal of time to his career. In 1908, again with his father's help, Johnson became the youngest sheriff in Atlantic City at the age of 25. And it would seem, there you have it all. Sit back and skim the cream. But Nucky was not going to stay in his father's shadow all his life and reap the fruits of his labor. Instead, he began laying his primary political foundation by winning the love of the locals. For example, he could turn a blind eye if a man stole something to feed his family, and instead of putting him away, he helped him find a job. He helped people with advice when they were in trouble with the law, helped with funds if a family situation was catastrophic, and did a bunch of other little things that altogether created the main thing, the image of a politician who cared. In a couple of years as sheriff, Nucky managed to get the people of Atlantic City to really love him, and beyond that, his father taught him the ins and outs of local politics and introduced him to the key players in it. It was because of his father that Enoch became very close to Lewis Cunel, showing him that he could do his bidding just as well as Johnson Sr. And when the Commodore was convicted of corruption in 1913, it was Nucky that he left as his successor. And so, by the age of 30, Johnson Jr. had become county treasurer and county leader of the Republican Party, which was the de facto powerhouse of Atlantic City, running elections as they pleased. As treasurer, he now had access to budget money as well as influence over government contracts. During the Commodore years, this position was where all the biggest bribes went. In the Nucky years, it would be the de facto top office in the city for the entire 30 years that Johnson would occupy it. In the party, however, Enoch officially held the office of secretary, which allowed him to call meetings, set their agendas, and most importantly, make the final decision as to what would and would not belong to the party. Although he had already proven himself in the elections during Cunel's time, he had yet to prove his own power at the polls. Nucky inherited from Commodore a system of government in which much of his political funds came from bribes from illegal establishments. Cunel used this money not only to buy electoral votes or for some personal purpose, but also for the good of the city. So he built a sewage treatment plant, ran a water main, and created an electric company that sold electricity at affordable prices. Nucky went even further and expanded this item of the unofficial budget. Cunel did these good deeds for large numbers of people at once. Johnson took a more cunning approach. When they built a large water supply for thousands of people, they soon take it for granted. But when one helps with a personal problem that touched one person, that same person will remember the good for a very, very long time. Enoch, in addition to big projects for the city, also helped with food, clothing, money, and whatever else was grouped or personalized. Today, he would help the Irish, tomorrow the Italians, and the day after tomorrow the blacks. For the latter, whose lives were not sweet in those days, he was almost a white god as he responded to almost every request. To give you an idea of how well his tactics worked, every national enclave in Atlantic City necessarily had a parish named Enoch Johnson. Nucky created such a positive image for himself by his actions that it made no difference to the locals whether he was taking bribes, stealing from the budget, much less rigging elections. But those were the locals. But there were people in Trenton who didn't like this kind of political power in Atlantic City. This was especially acute when a Democrat became governor. The last time this happened, Cunel was in jail, and Nucky did not want to repeat his fate, which required him to gain influence in the party outside his district and somehow get the Democrats to play by his rules. The first opportunity presented itself to Johnson in 1916 when he got at the helm of the campaign for governor of New Jersey for the Atlantic City Senator Walter Edge. First, he raised the necessary money to run the campaign. Second, he secured Edge an unqualified victory in Atlantic County. And thirdly, and decisively, he succeeded in getting Democrats on his side. Nucky knew that Democratic leader Frank Hague did not like the candidate the party had chosen to fight, and Johnson offered Hague a deal. He would publicly disown his candidate Otto Whitpen, and Enoch, in turn, would promise that his candidate would listen to Hague if he won. This worked, and Whitpen lost a substantial portion of his vote, and Edge became governor. In gratitude, he appointed Nucky clerk of the New Jersey Supreme Court, which allowed him to visit the state capitol more often and make connections there. In the future, the connections made here would strengthen Enoch's influence over statewide politics, allowing him to become the main man in New Jersey. Nucky will win more than one more election, making the people who come to him governors, senators, and mayors. But I don't think you'll want to hear about the tricks he used to bring these people to power. The only thing to stress here is that Johnson, by electing Edge, proved his influence and secured his political immunity at the state level, which he then maintained year after year. But his main sphere of influence was still Atlantic City, and I think it's worthwhile to go into some more detail about how Johnson's power system was structured here. Where to begin is how Nucky was able to secure any result in his district that was needed in the election. The first, and what cannot be denied, is the love for him from ordinary townspeople, most often of small means. As I said before, he helped them, and they gave him their votes in the election. But this was not enough to guarantee a permanent result, and Johnson resorted to illegal tricks. So on election day, the city was filled with hundreds of commuters who were registered as seasonal workers in local establishments, thereby giving them the legal right to vote in Atlantic City. They threw the ballots as Nucky, who paid for their services, would tell them to do. Also on election day, Johnson's people would go out to particularly poor neighborhoods and pay people there for the right votes. and there were thugs standing outside the precincts to keep the wrong citizens from voting. That is, although formally there was no falsification and no one threw in their ballots, the election could not be called fair. And Nucky, by securing victory in Atlantic City, secured it for the whole county because 60% of the population of the county lived in that city, while the rest were rural dwellers, many of whom were indifferent to this election. Well, if Johnson controlled the election, he could control everything else. The mayor, the sheriff, the judges all allowed him their positions and did whatever he said. If some visiting commission decided to put the casino operators away, the sheriff would pick the right jurors, the judge would turn a blind eye, and the commission would be left to watch as the guilty were acquitted. Nucky even managed to make local Democrats their puppets. This party had no real power in Atlantic City before, but its moves to reform and combat illegal activities constantly irritated the city bosses. Johnson managed to neutralize this as well. In fact, he turned the local Democrats into a branch of the Republicans, and all it took was letting a hostile party into the trough. The bosses before Enoch had pushed the Democrats out of power in every way possible, both from power and from the money that came from it. Nucky, on the other hand, negotiated with the Democratic leaders that in return for their loyalty and playing by the rules already established, they would get a cut of the multiple acts of stealing budget money. The Democrats agreed, and until the end of Johnson's reign, so to speak, did not interfere in any way with the Republican Party here. Thus, Enoch was gaining in Atlantic City a power comparable to that of some vassal under a king. And what does a feudal lord do in his domain? That's right, he recruits a retinue and begins to collect taxes. Johnson's retinue, of course, was the police under his brother Alfred. Nucky took the hiring of his men very seriously, and if someone wanted to join the local police force, Enoch's men would first make inquiries about that person, and then the candidate would be interviewed by the county's treasurer himself. In this way, Johnson was trying to weed out disloyal people as much as possible, for the duties of Atlantic City police officers were far beyond the maintenance of public order. They had to convince illegal operators to pay Nucky for protection and then collect those payments every week, and basically the local cops did all the dirty work for Johnson. Beatings, intimidation, obstruction of justice, and a bunch of other illegal stuff. For example, a man could go to Nucky and ask him for a job. Enoch would help by getting him a government job, but in return he would demand a certain amount of money each month. And then after a while the man would decide that he didn't want to pay anymore. Of course, you could just fire him, but instead, Nucky would send in the cops, who would give him a good beating so that he would eventually start paying again. By the way, in Atlantic City, paying public servants to Johnson was a common practice in general. Everyone who worked for the local government, except police officers, paid $1 to $7 a month into the Republican Party coffers, depending on what the person's salary was. I think you have already traced some similarities between the methods of Johnson, a kind of official politician, and gangsters. What I described above is typical racketeering, and Nucky, in spite of his public office, was a typical racketeer. Only if the gangsters were scamming a particular neighborhood or area of operation, Johnson took over an entire city and milked it for the benefit of himself and his political machine. You want to be in Atlantic City as a wholesale supplier of coal or meat or whatever? Pay Nucky. You want to get a government contract? Pay the Nucky. You want to open a casino or a brothel? Pay the Nucky. Enoch really was like a godfather to whom one came to settle an issue. The only difference between him and a typical gangster was that Johnson often had the carrot before the stick. Yes, he stole money from the city, and all the money flowed to him in one way or another, and he maintained power in ways that were not legal, but Nucky also gave back to the city. I mentioned before that he was helping the poor people of Atlantic City. He had people in each neighborhood who kept an eye on how the locals were living, and if anyone had a problem, they got help right away. Beyond that, Nucky also cared about the development of the city. Under him, the train station was renovated, and also the largest convention center in the country was built, which allowed Atlantic City to become the state's premier showbiz venue. New musicals and theatrical performances premiered here, and famous singers lined up to perform in this facility. The convention center became a place of attraction where people were willing to come even outside of the holiday season. And as you know, people at the resort equals the prosperity of the city. However, you shouldn't get the false impression that Johnson was a douchebag thinking solely about the development of the town and the well-being of its residents. All of his actions were primarily for his own benefit. Helping people provided votes, votes provided political power, and power provided an opportunity to make money with little regard for the law. and Nucky gladly used this opportunity. Unfortunately, I can't say exactly how much he earned since Enoch's activity were clandestine and not publicized. But I can give you some figures which have surfaced to date, and you can decide if that's a lot or a little. Let's start with the illegal sector. The entire Johnson system, which should more properly be called a gang, received in 1 week $1,200 from each illegal lottery operator, $160 from each bookmaker, $350 from each bingo game, and $100 from each brothel. This is the data from the U.S. Department of Justice, which also indicates that there were 20 bookmakers, 16 lotteries, and 8 bingo halls and brothels. And that's only the big establishments that were counted. Slickly multiply all this by the number of weeks in a year, and you get $1,352,000. The same Justice Department estimates that Nucky personally received between $300,000 and $500,000. To this, we must also add the budget splurges, kickbacks on government contracts, and from the wholesale suppliers who wanted to work in the city. The figures for the first and third never made it to the masses, but there is an example of the second. In 1934, Nucky received $28,000 in cash kickbacks from Tony Miller for the construction of the Atlantic City train station. But as for anyone associated with crime in the early 20th century U.S., it was Prohibition that brought Johnson the most money. Unfortunately, there are no exact figures on how much Nucky raised from illegal liquor, but if you consider what I will tell you next, it is safe to assume that it came out to about the same amount per year as from bribes, if not even more. Already, in many of the biographies on this channel, I have touched on crime at the time of the Volstead Act. But for the most part, the focus has been on New York or Chicago. Regular viewers of my channel already know that these cities operated underground bars where alcohol was sold. When the authorities were willing to take bribes, the establishments worked without problems. But as soon as the authorities changed to disloyal ones, there were raids, closures, and so on down the list. That is, although they were able to sell alcohol, it was, so to speak, under the table and with constant fear of raids. But Atlantic City was a different story. By the 1920s, when the teetotalers gained the upper hand, Nucky had completely taken over the city and secured his own state cover. And that meant that Johnson himself was making the rules here. And by his tacit order, there was no de facto prohibition in Atlantic City. Once here, you could buy alcohol wherever you could before Prohibition. Bars, cafes, restaurants, hotels, nightclubs, grocery stores, and even drugstores had alcohol everywhere. And the owners of the establishments did not even think to hide this fact, but on the contrary, exhibited it to their advantage. And who do you think supplied all this alcohol to thirsty tourists? Nucky, of course. The captains of the big ships brought to the ocean-flooded Atlantic City the goods from abroad, anchored outside territorial waters. There, Johnson's men would drive up in speedboats, pick up the liquor, and bring it back to the city. All the people working for the city in one way or another were involved in liquor smuggling. Police officers, for example, fought those members of the Coast Guard who would not agree to take bribes. Usually, if such an honest crew took a smuggler, the crew itself would already be taken by the police, charging them with abuse of power and attempted murder. Since the Coast Guard not infrequently fired warning shots into the air, and bootleggers in the corrupt Atlantic City court safely avoided punishment. The firefighters were in the business too. It was at the bay near the firehouse that the liquor boats would come in, and the firefighters would help unload them. If there was a lot of cargo, the necessary number of civil servants were rushed to their aid, so that overnight all the goods were already in the trucks that would take them to the buyers. That is, so you can understand the scale on which Enoch was deployed. An entire town was supplied with booze by him and his men. Some might say, what a town, not even 100,000 inhabitants. But don't forget that Atlantic City at the time was one of the nation's premier resorts, which offset its lack of small indigenous population with a large stream of visiting tourists willing to part with their money without hesitation. Smuggling is understandable, but what about the local production of alcohol? After all, in the TV series, Thompson not only imported goods, but also set up distilleries. In life, however, Johnson left that method to other people, but not in the sense that Nucky just let it go on his own, but in the sense that he only got a cut for working in his town, not setting up production himself. And while we're talking about Prohibition, of course you'll want to know about Enoch's connections with other bootleggers, gangsters, and mobsters, because there is a whole series of relationships linking Atlantic City, New York, and Chicago. And all of this was not just invented by the writers, but there is even an exact event from which all the theories about a unified network of gangsters across the country derive. And that event is a nationwide convention of major U.S. gang leaders in 1929 in Atlantic City. The only catch here is that there really was no convention. Gangsters did meet, but it was Chicago gang leaders who wanted to negotiate peace on neutral ground. David Crickley talks about this beautifully in his book on the early mafia, explaining that this myth appeared over time, and that all the newspapers then wrote about a local meeting, not a national convention, such as the appellation would later become for the mafia. And that raises a bit of a problem, because the idea that Nucky was integrated into the highest circles of organized crime in the States grows out of just that meeting. Like, if so many gang leaders came to his town, if he attended that meeting, that means he had connections in the criminal world all over the country. And if he didn't have this convention, then what if he didn't have any connections? To tell you the truth, I couldn't find any information on that, and I don't know if he had any connections in the criminal circles of New York or Detroit or Cleveland. Whether he was acquainted, as in the show, with Rothstein, Luciano, or Lansky. But what I can tell you is that Johnson had ties with the Torrio Capone organization of Chicago. Initially, he did business with them through his partner, John D'Agostino, who was well connected in criminal circles and knew Torrio. And in 1921, Nucky had personally met them at a Dembski-Carpentier boxing match. This meeting marked the beginning of a long collaboration between Johnson and Chicago. After Prohibition, he and Torrio would even buy a huge brewery together, and Capone would trust him so much that he would choose Atlantic City for a peaceful conference of Chicago gangs. Well, if you have any facts about this connections to the criminal community in other cities, I'd love to read about them in the comments. We'll move on, however, and talk a little bit about how Johnson lived outside his business. For a man who made about $500,000 a year, which in today's money translates to almost $9 million, and was a major force in the tourist center of the United States, most likely didn't live an entirely ordinary life, especially in the Roaring '20s. Johnson's day most often began in the afternoon when he woke up in his luxurious room at the Ritz Hotel. With coffee upon awakening, he would proceed to his office, where a newspaper, breakfast, and subordinates with reports awaited him. Listening alternately to racketeers and politicians, Nucky would dispose of his food and run a quick glance over the morning news. By 4 p.m., the hotel reception was over, and Johnson, donning one of his hundreds of custom-made suits and pinning a red carnation on it, went out to the waterfront for a stroll, where beggars were already waiting for him. People who needed help would come here, knowing they would see Nucky. Enoch also listened to them all and tried to help as much as he could. This activity usually took an hour or two, after which Johnson would go back to the hotel and go swimming in the pool. In this way, he tried to maintain his physical fitness. Once he was done with his physical activities, Nucky would go to an evening event, which could be different each time, from a dinner party or a nightclub party to a political meeting. He would return home in the morning with a certain lady of easy virtue who, according to his driver, managed to please her beau in the car before the hotel. That was how Johnson's typical day went. As for his parties, money flew out of his pockets at such events like confetti from a firecracker. Here's what the New York Nightlife Observer wrote about him at the time. Nucky liked to visit New York when Atlantic City was out of the tourist season. Nucky is one of the city's most carefree spenders. He is always accompanied by a group of hangers-on, mostly female, whom he takes from one nightclub to another, paying all the bills. Many times he gives the waiter a $20 bill for an extra napkin. A $100 tip is commonplace for him. Nucky was so popular in restaurants and nightclubs in New York that the waiters' union made him an honorary member. Johnson just loved to go out and splurge. Buy an entire row for himself and friends at a baseball game or a boxing match? It was easy. Like a Broadway production, why not bring the whole troupe to Atlantic City and party with them all weekend? And if a star came to perform in Nucky City himself, Enoch would throw a party in his honor and take care of all the expenses. Johnson was literally the star of the town, embodying its prosperity and the spirit of entertainment that was at every turn in Atlantic City. In the 1920s and 30s, he did pretty much whatever he wanted and carried no punishment. Election fraud, bribes, kickbacks, bootlegging, and patronizing the underworld. For more than 2 decades, he managed to make money out of it and live on it like the great Gatsby. But no matter how big a fish Nucky was, every year he made more and more noise with his activities, which attracted even bigger fish ready to eat him with all his guts. Johnson has been tried since the beginning of his career in power. The first time he came under scrutiny was as sheriff. Then Commodore Cunell in 1910s helped Republican Lewis get elected governor of New Jersey. Lewis lost, however, and the office was taken by Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who only lost in defeat in Atlantic County. Suspecting there was something wrong, Wilson set the investigating authorities on Cunell. who tried to put away the Commodore, and the people who had helped him in the rigging, among whom was Nucky. In the end, the case stalled in the Atlantic City justice machine, and Enoch got away with it. Cunel, on the other hand, Wilson got him after a couple of years and sent him to prison for so-called conflict of interest. Investigators found evidence that the Commodore, as head of the Atlantic City Water Resources Board, had contracted to lay a new water main with a company that was partly as much his own. The second time authorities took up Nucky in earnest was after Hamilton Keene was elected senator from New Jersey. Johnson headed his campaign and spent far more money on it than was officially allowed at the time. But the special committee that investigated the case could prove nothing. So Keene went on to serve as a senator, and Nucky went back to his murky business. That all changed the third time, when Johnson was hunted not by some governor or special committee, but by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Why, you may ask? Did he have to bring down Nucky? And there were actually several reasons for that. First of all, Roosevelt came to power when the country was still reeling from the effects of the Great Depression. Atlantic City at the time was a sorry-looking place, sustained solely by illegal establishments like casinos and brothels, which made the glory of the city entertainment for all tastes into a branded vice city. And shutting down whoever controlled this hotbed of lust and gambling would have been a good PR move for the Roosevelt cabinet. Secondly, as those close to the 32nd president recalled, Roosevelt had an extreme dislike for politicians he could not fully govern, and Johnson was just such a man. And third, there were several people around the president who had a personal grudge against Nucky. The first was Woodrow Wilson, a close friend of Roosevelt. As governor of New Jersey, he put Commodore Cunel behind bars and thought he had decapitated the Republican corrupt Cloaca of Atlantic City. In fact, he only made room for a new leader, which was Johnson. Wilson realized this too late, when his terms as governor and president were behind him. So all he had to do was encourage Roosevelt to deal with Nucky. The second person who dripped this idea on the president's brain was his comrade and newspaper magnate William Hearst. Johnson had stolen a girl from Hearst in the late 1920s while he was in Atlantic City. The newspaper man had held a huge grudge against Enoch, and when his friend became president, decided that he could help him avenge his wounded manhood. As you can see, the idea of taking down Nucky was embedded in Roosevelt's brain as much as it was in Nolan's movie Inception. And that is why IRS and FBI agents, led by Special Agent William Frank, arrived in Atlantic City in November 1936 and were ordered to put Enoch Johnson in jail by any legal means necessary, no matter how long it took. The IRS immediately began checking all of Nucky's returns, reconciling it all with his spending. But even though Enoch lived in a luxury hotel room, had his own fleet of cars, and ate at restaurants, they could not find anything. His official income covered his expenses. This meant that it would not be possible to put him away so quickly. So the agents prepared for trench warfare. Now the strategy was to work with the FBI to find Johnson's illicit proceeds in the form of bribes or kickbacks and build a case based on them. For 4 long years, agents tried to nail everyone associated with Nucky, from casino and brothel owners to those who participated with him in the theft of budget money. However, people were sent to prison but refused to talk. It wasn't until 1940 that they were able to find 2 weak links. Ralph Veloff agreed to testify about paying Johnson to protect his illegal lottery, and Joseph Corio testified about how Nucky received kickbacks for building the train station. Leaders of the Atlantic City underworld suggested that Johnson remove the witnesses so that the authorities would have nothing to build their cases on. But Enoch understood that this would only encourage Roosevelt's attention to him and decided that the best way was to win in court. This time, however, luck turned away from Nucky. At the age of 58, Johnson found himself not above but outside the law for the first time. He was found guilty of tax evasion. On August 1, 1941, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison and fined $20,000. Naturally, his lawyers immediately appealed, but this only delayed his sentence, allowing Enoch, nevertheless, to marry a second time. That girl was Florence Osbeck, who was the only one with whom Nucky had been able to build a long relationship since the death of his first wife, Mabel. The power over the city and the Republican political machine was given by Johnson to Frank Farley, who was able to convince others that he was worthy of his unofficial position. And Nucky, having finished his business, went to prison. He was in Lewisburg, where he received a warm welcome. Because he had connections with Chicago, Enoch was protected in prison by the outfit. But by and large, not even the help of the mob was needed to allow Johnson to serve his time in peace. His fame went before him, and his patronage deeds, which he did on a regular basis for the full 30 years at the helm of Atlantic City, touched many of the residents of the place in one way or another. Nucky here was a respected member of the community who was listened to, which even caused him to be asked by the warden to induce inmates to get an education. So it was thanks to Johnson that many left Lewisburg in those years with new careers. Enoch himself was released from prison before he had served half of his sentence, and in 1945, after 4 years in prison, he was released on parole for good behavior. Many thought he would now try to regain his position and power, but Johnson chose a different path. He decided to just live. After filing for analogous bankruptcy to avoid paying a court-ordered fine, Enoch's main income for the rest of his life was his advertising agent's salary and his wife's income. Whether he still had savings from his golden days is not known, but at least the authorities could not prove their existence. Now, he had the life of an ordinary citizen. Walking along the waterfront, going to restaurants, and hosting friends for dinner were all things Enoch had to take care of during the last 20 years of his life. In the summer of 1968, he asked his wife to move him to a nursing home to receive care after a broken leg. And on December 9th of that year, he died in the ward of that institution of natural causes. At the time of his death, Nucky was 85 years old. That was the story of Enoch Nucky Johnson, a man on both sides of the law. And whether his fate was dictated by his environment or whether he chose that path for himself, everyone will answer for himself.